Good morning, everyone, and thank you for the kind introduction, although I'm not a professor just yet. This day I would like to speak to you about endpoints in breast cancer research, and I'd like to start by discussing why we should be bothered about breast cancer endpoints in the first place. This will all be familiar to you, I guess, if you read breast cancer publications regularly. You could encounter several different endpoints in publications, such as breast cancer-free interval, disease-free survival, distant relapse-free survival, and disease-specific survival, event-free survival. And one might wonder, are these all the same? Can they be readily compared? And if you look a bit more specifically into these endpoints in the publications themselves, you might encounter differences in the definitions of those endpoints. For instance, on this slide, you can see two definitions of local recurrence, which I found in breast cancer publications. And as you can see, the first one is has a rather broad definition of local recurrence. It includes the entire ipsilateral breast, but also homolateral lymph nodes, whereas the second one only includes recurrences in the original tumor bed, which had the same histopathological features as the original tumor. But both are described in the publication as local recurrence. So if we think about these differences, are we comparing apples and oranges when we are reading different breast cancer publications? If there are these kinds of inconsistencies in endpoint definitions in the articles that we use to make treatment plans for our patients, this might seriously limit transparency of the results and also limit reliable comparison of those study results, which also includes pooling them, for instance, in meta-analysis. So we asked ourselves the question, what is the extent of this problem of these inconsistent endpoint definitions? So the aim of our project was to determine which endpoints are used in breast cancer research and how their local and regional events were defined. And to make somewhat more clear why we focused on the events, I would like to show you that most endpoints that we use in breast cancer research are actually composite endpoints, meaning that they are composed of different events. For instance, local regional recurrence-free survival might include local events, regional events, and also some measure of mortality or survival. But these events are in turn composed of different components. So local events might include ipsilateral breast recurrences, but also skin. It might or might not include DCIS and LCIS, and it might also or might not include the contralateral breast. And we thought we should start at the very basis, so we looked into these events before we looked into the composite endpoints. And to get an idea of the extent of the problem, we did a PubMed search as a sample of breast cancer literature. We looked for experimental and observational breast cancer studies which were published in 2011 in 9 high-impact journals publishing on cancer or breast cancer. And we included all studies that used an endpoint which had at least a local or regional component. And when we performed this search, we found 44 publications using 23 different endpoints that had a local or regional component. And most often we found disease-free survival, recurrence-free survival, local control, and so on. But there were 23 different ones that we encountered in just these 44 publications. And from these 23 endpoints, we looked at whether or not the article provided a definition of the endpoint. And in 5 cases, no definition at all was provided in the article. And in 18 cases, a partial definition was given. And this could be either the start in a time to event endpoint. For instance, disease-free survival was defined as the time from randomization or from surgery or from something like that. And it could also, the definition could also include the events that were used in the definition. And we first looked at the local events that were used in the publications. And in almost 60% of cases, there was no events described, none of the events that were included in the local event. And if a definition was given, if events were specified, the breast was often mentioned as expected. In situ carcinomas were sometimes specifically excluded, but more often than not mentioned how this was treated. And also skin was sometimes included as a local event, sometimes excluded and included as a regional event, and in the majority of cases not mentioned. And this pattern was the same when we looked at the regional components. Also in almost 60%, none of the included events were mentioned. And if events were mentioned, obviously the lymph nodes were mentioned quite a lot, but sometimes they were also included as local recurrences. And we looked also at the specific lymph node sites, if they were included or excluded as regional recurrences, and particularly about the supra and infraclavicular lymph nodes, there was lots of uncertainty whether or not they were counted. And also chest wall recurrences were sometimes specifically included as regional events, sometimes specifically excluded, and often this was unclear from the publication. So, in conclusion, we found that in this sample of breast cancer literature, many different endpoints were used in the publications. Definitions were not always provided by the authors, and if provided, these definitions varied between studies. So even if we only looked at the local and the regional component, these definitions varied, and we actually might be comparing apples and oranges. So as a consequence, this limits the interpretation of the results and also the comparison of the studies. And in the meantime, we've taken a few steps to improve this, because we thought to avoid comparing apples and oranges, we should encourage researchers all over the world to use consistent definitions of the endpoints. So we did a large consensus project with an international panel of breast cancer experts, and we reached consensus about the definition of local event, regional event, second primary breast cancer, and distant event for use in breast cancer research, so for classification of recurrences in breast cancer research. And this consensus you can be found in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute, and the other results of the literature sample review were published in the British Journal of Surgery for future reference. And we encourage researchers to use these definitions, at least standardized definitions of the endpoints they use in their studies, to improve transparency and to facilitate reliable comparison of the results. So we won't be comparing apples and oranges, and we can have reliable results to recommend treatment to our patients. So thank you for your attention.